In the autumn of 1944, the remote Arctic front, often overlooked amid the vast battles of the Eastern Front, became the scene of one of the most decisive Soviet offensives of the war's final year. The Petsamo Kirkenes offensive was launched by the Red Army in October with the aim of driving German forces out of northern Finland and Norway, securing the Arctic coastline, and eliminating the German hold on critical nickel mines in Petsamo. Though small in scale compared to the massive clashes at Kursk or Operation Bagration, the campaign had important strategic, economic, and political consequences. The context of this operation stretched back to 1941, when German forces, alongside Finnish allies, launched Operation Silver Fox in an attempt to capture Murmansk. Though they advanced into Soviet territory, the Germans failed to take Murmansk and instead settled into defensive positions across northern Finland, holding key areas such as Petsamo. This region was valuable not only for its strategic position on the Arctic coast, but also for its rich deposits of nickel ore, vital to German armaments production. Throughout the war, these mines supplied thousands of tons of nickel annually, sustaining German steel and weapons manufacturing. By 1944, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Red Army had launched sweeping offensives across Eastern Europe, while Germany was retreating on multiple fronts. In September, Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union, agreeing to expel German forces from its territory. This left the German 20th Mountain Army, under General Lothar Rendulic, isolated in the far north. With roughly 200,000 men spread across northern Norway and Finland, their orders from Berlin were to conduct a fighting withdrawal while denying the Allies access to key resources and ports. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was determined to secure its northern flank and safeguard the Murmansk railway and supply routes, which continued to deliver vital Lend-Lease material from Allied convoys. Stalin also sought to eliminate the German presence in Petsamo, both to secure the mines and to fulfill part of the wider objective of pushing German forces completely out of Soviet territory. The offensive would be conducted by the Karelian Front under General Kirill Meretskov, with substantial reinforcements, including the 14th Army, several rifle corps, and supporting naval and air units from the Northern Fleet and the 7th Air Army. Preparations for the operation highlighted the unique challenges of Arctic warfare. The terrain consisted of barren tundra, rocky ridges, and marshes, with few roads and limited infrastructure. Harsh weather, with temperatures dropping close to freezing in October and snow already beginning to fall, complicated logistics and movement. The Red Army had to adapt with specialized clothing, sled transport, and reliance on reindeer and horses, in addition to motor vehicles. Supply depots were stocked in advance, and engineers built or repaired tracks to allow for artillery movement. Public sentiment among Soviet troops was influenced by both the strategic significance and the hardships of fighting in the far north. Many had served in the region since 1941, enduring long years of static warfare. For civilians, especially the Sami population and Finnish settlers, the coming battle promised yet another round of displacement and destruction, as both armies had already requisitioned resources and disrupted. Thus, by early October 1944, the stage was set for the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive. The Red Army assembled more than 100,000 troops, supported by over 1,000 artillery pieces and mortars, as well as significant naval support from the Northern Fleet. The Germans, though numerically strong in the wider region, had fewer than 50,000 men directly defending the Petsamo sector, relying on strong fortifications, minefields, and natural terrain barriers. Both sides recognized the stakes. For Germany, it was about delaying the inevitable retreat and protecting access to vital resources for as long as possible. For the Soviet Union, it was about securing the Arctic and advancing into Norway as part of the final expulsion of German forces from occupied Europe. The offensive, though overshadowed by larger campaigns in Central and Southern Europe, would become one of the most successful Soviet operations in the Northern Theater, reshaping the strategic map of the Arctic and leaving a lasting mark on the wartime history of Scandinavia. On 7 October 1944, the Soviet 14th Army opened the Petsamo Kirkenes offensive with concentrated artillery barrages and coordinated infantry assaults against German defensive lines east of Petsamo. The initial attacks were preceded by a powerful air campaign. The 7th Air Army flew hundreds of sorties to strike German strongpoints, supply depots, and communication lines. Simultaneously, the Northern Fleet provided naval gunfire support from the Barents Sea, bombarding coastal batteries and supply nodes. This combined arms opening reflected careful preparation and the recognition that the terrain and fortifications would require overwhelming firepower to dislodge defenders. The Germans had prepared layered defensive positions, consisting of trenches, bunkers, and extensive minefields supported by artillery batteries. These positions were manned by elements of the 19th Mountain Corps, with strong points anchored on high ground that commanded open tundra approaches. Rendulich's 20th Mountain Army had orders to delay the Soviet advance while preparing for an organized withdrawal into Norway. German forces numbered approximately 45,000 in the immediate sector, but their ability to maneuver was constrained by poor road networks and constant Soviet air attacks. The Soviet assault began with infantry divisions advancing across the barren landscape, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns where terrain permitted. Progress on the first day was limited, as German defenders used well-prepared positions to inflict casualties and delay advances. However, by 8 October, Soviet forces exploited gaps between German battalions, pushing through minefields under heavy artillery cover. Units of the 99th Rifle Corps and 131st Rifle Division captured forward trenches, forcing German troops to fall back to secondary lines. Key commanders played central roles in these opening maneuvers. General Meretskov coordinated the overall operation, while Lieutenant General Ivan Shvetsov directed the 14th Army's attacks on the main Petsamo axis. On the German side, General Ferdinand Jodl, commanding the 19th Mountain Corps, attempted to orchestrate a fighting withdrawal, relying heavily on rearguard actions and demolitions to slow the Soviet advance. German sappers destroyed bridges and laid additional minefields, forcing Soviet engineers into constant work under fire. The reactions of both sides reflected the intensity of the opening phase. Soviet reports emphasized steady progress despite strong resistance, highlighting the capture of key ridges and the destruction of German bunkers. German accounts describe the overwhelming firepower of Soviet artillery and airstrikes, noting the difficulty of holding positions without adequate air support. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a handful of operational squadrons in the far north, was unable to contest Soviet control of the skies. Civilian populations, particularly Sami reindeer herders and Finnish settlers, experienced immediate disruption. As the Germans executed scorched earth measures, villages were evacuated or destroyed to deny shelter to advancing Soviet forces. Civilians were displaced in large numbers, some moving westward with retreating German columns, others forced to seek refuge in the tundra. The Soviet advance brought liberation to some communities, but also the hardships of bombardment and rapid military occupation. By 10th of October, the Red Army had advanced up to 20 kilometers in some sectors, breaking through the 1st and 2nd German defensive belts. Petsamo itself came under direct threat as Soviet forces pressed westward. German counterattacks were limited, reflecting the broader strategic decision to prioritize delaying actions rather than costly defensive battles. The opening phase had achieved its objective. Soviet troops had breached fortified lines, inflicted heavy casualties, and forced the Germans into retreat, setting the stage for deeper advances toward Norway and the capture of key industrial and logistical targets. The strategic goals and planning behind the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive reflected both the Soviet Union's broader aims in late 1944 and the German necessity of salvaging what remained of their northern position. For the Soviets, the objective was clear: eliminate the German 20th Mountain Army from Soviet soil, secure the Murmansk supply routes, and extend pressure into northern Norway. For the Germans, the plan was not to hold every position to the last man, but to execute a disciplined withdrawal that would protect critical resources and deny the Soviets the chance to envelop or destroy large formations. General Kirill Meretskov's Karelian Front, responsible for the operation, developed a comprehensive plan that combined land, air, and sea assets in one of the most coordinated offensives attempted in the Arctic theater. The 14th Army, numbering more than 100,000 men, formed the main striking force, supported by several rifle corps, specialized engineer units, and tank brigades adapted for tundra operations. Artillery strength exceeded 1,000 pieces, while air support from the 7th Air Army provided over 700 aircraft for bombing ground. Naval support came from the Northern Fleet under Admiral Arseny Golovko, which deployed cruisers, destroyers, and submarines to protect the flanks of the land advance and interdict German sea traffic along the coast. Operationally, the Soviet plan aimed for a breakthrough in the Petsamo sector, followed by a rapid drive toward Kirkenes in northern Norway. The capture of Petsamo was especially important because of its nickel mines, which produced between 60,000 and 70,000 tons of ore annually, resources vital to German steel and armament production. Denying Berlin this supply would weaken the German war economy while simultaneously allowing the Soviets to remove the last German foothold on Soviet territory. Logistics were central to Soviet planning. The Arctic presented severe challenges: few roads, swampy terrain, short daylight hours, and early snowfalls in October. To overcome these, Soviet engineers built temporary roads and bridges, while supply depots were established months in advance. Reindeer and horses were used alongside trucks to move supplies. The Red Army also stockpiled winter clothing, fuel, and rations to sustain the offensive in freezing conditions. The reliance on combined logistical solutions reflected lessons learned from years of fighting in harsh environments. German planning, by contrast, focused on preserving manpower and conducting a staged withdrawal. The 20th Mountain Army, commanded by General Lothar Rendulic, numbered roughly 200,000 men across the entire northern theater, though fewer than 50,000 were deployed directly against the Soviet offensive. Berlin had ordered Operation Nordlicht, not to be confused with the planned 1942 offensive of the same name, as a strategic withdrawal from northern Finland into Norway. The intention was to abandon Petsamo, but to delay Soviet advances long enough to evacuate stockpiled nickel ore, remove valuable equipment, and prepare defensive lines in Finnmark, northern Norway. The German doctrine of defense in the Arctic relied heavily on natural terrain and prepared fortifications. Mountain and tundra landscapes were well suited for rearguard actions, while minefields and demolitions slowed the Soviet advance. Rendulic instructed his corps commanders, such as General Ferdinand Jodl of the 19th Mountain Corps, to avoid decisive engagements and instead focus on delaying tactics. The Luftwaffe could offer little support, with only a handful of aircraft available in the far north, so German planning emphasized artillery, demolitions, and mobility along pre-prepared withdrawal routes. Miscalculations existed on both sides. Soviet planners underestimated the difficulty of sustaining rapid advances through broken terrain, where narrow roads and constant demolitions slowed progress despite numerical superiority. The Germans underestimated the scale of Soviet preparation and the effectiveness of Soviet naval support in amphibious and coastal operations, which would later allow landings behind German positions. Furthermore, German scorched earth policies alienated local populations and created logistical chaos, making their retreat more arduous. Propaganda framed the operation in different ways. Soviet announcements emphasized the liberation of Soviet soil and the destruction of German strongholds in the far north, linking the Arctic operation with larger offensives sweeping across Eastern Europe in 1944. The operation was presented as part of the inevitable collapse of Nazi Germany. German propaganda, on the other hand, sought to portray the withdrawal as a deliberate, controlled maneuver, downplaying Soviet gains while stressing the resilience of German mountain troops under extreme conditions. The strategic goals of each side were thus deeply asymmetrical. The Soviets sought destruction of enemy forces, territorial liberation, and denial of resources, while the Germans aimed at preservation through withdrawal and delay. The Arctic theater magnified these differences, as the environment imposed unique constraints on operations. By October 1944, both armies understood that the campaign's outcome would not alter the overall course of the war, but its regional consequences, control of nickel, ports, and sea routes, were significant enough to demand concentrated effort. As Soviet artillery and air bombardments opened the offensive and ground units advanced into Petsamo, these divergent strategies collided. The Germans executed demolitions and scorched earth measures as planned, but the scale of the Soviet assault quickly placed their rear guards under immense pressure. The planning stage had set the framework, an operation where the Red Army's combined strength and preparation sought to outpace the German retreat and achieve more than just a territorial gain. It aimed at a decisive blow in the Arctic. The first engagements of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive revealed both the intensity of the Soviet push and the determination of German defenders to execute their withdrawal with discipline. On 7 October 1944, after a heavy preparatory bombardment, Soviet infantry from the 14th Army moved forward in multiple sectors. The initial clashes centered on strongpoints east of Petsamo, where the German 19th Mountain Corps had established fortified lines with trenches, bunkers, and minefields. Soviet rifle divisions advanced behind creeping barrages, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns where the tundra terrain allowed, while engineers cleared passages through minefields under constant fire. German troops, many of them experienced mountain soldiers, used the broken ridges and rocky outcrops to their advantage. Rearguard actions slowed Soviet progress, with machine gun nests and mortar fire inflicting casualties. Nevertheless, Soviet superiority in artillery and air support gradually forced withdrawals. By 9th October, units of the 99th Rifle Corps had penetrated the first line of defenses, capturing key heights that overlooked the approaches to Petsamo. The 131st Rifle Division reported seizing several fortified villages after prolonged fighting, while the Luftwaffe's minimal presence allowed the 7th Air Army to operate almost unchallenged. Naval support added another dimension to the opening battles. The Northern Fleet used destroyers and coastal artillery to bombard German positions near the coast, while small amphibious detachments landed behind enemy lines to disrupt communications. German forces responded with coastal batteries and demolitions, destroying bridges and depots as they retreated. These measures slowed the Soviet advance, but could not prevent territorial losses. Civilians in the Petsamo region endured immediate upheaval. German scorched earth tactics meant that villages were set ablaze, food stocks destroyed, and infrastructure demolished. Sami families and Finnish settlers were forced to abandon their homes, some retreating with German units into Norway, others encountering advancing Soviet troops. Reports described widespread destruction of livestock and reindeer herds, as both armies requisitioned resources for their operations. By 10th October, the Red Army had advanced 20-25 kilometers in some sectors, forcing the Germans into secondary defense. The capture of Petsamo itself was imminent, with Soviet artillery already bombarding the outskirts. German counterattacks were limited, typically small-scale actions by mountain infantry intended to cover demolitions or protect withdrawing convoys. These delaying tactics inflicted losses, but could not halt the momentum of the Soviet offensive. Morale on both sides reflected the shifting balance. Soviet troops, motivated by the prospect of clearing the last German foothold on Soviet soil, pressed forward despite harsh weather and difficult terrain. German units, while disciplined, recognized the impossibility of holding Petsamo indefinitely. Their task had shifted from defending ground to preserving manpower and equipment for the retreat into Norway. The first engagements thus demonstrated the character of the campaign. Soviet combined arms assaults, coordinated with naval and air support, steadily overpowering German defenses, while German forces sought to delay and destroy infrastructure during their withdrawal. The result was a rapid territorial shift, with Petsamo under threat, and the wider German position in northern Finland becoming increasingly untenable. As the offensive entered its second week, the Petsamo-Kirkenes campaign escalated into a broader crisis for German forces and a complex operational challenge for the Soviets. Between 11 and 15 October 1944, the battle expanded beyond the immediate Petsamo sector as the Red Army pressed deeper into German positions, aiming to complete the expulsion of the Wehrmacht from Soviet territory and to carry the fighting into Norway. The scale of destruction, displacement, and attrition intensified dramatically during these days. On 11 October, Soviet rifle divisions of the 14th Army launched concentrated attacks on Petsamo itself. After heavy artillery and aerial bombardments, Soviet infantry advanced into the outskirts of the town. German defenders, primarily elements of the 2nd and 6th Mountain Divisions, resisted with machine guns and mortars, while conducting demolitions of infrastructure and depots. Fighting spread through the streets, but by 12 October, Petsamo had been secured by Soviet troops, with the Germans retreating westward under pressure. The capture of Petsamo marked the end of German control of the valuable nickel mines, depriving the Reich of a critical supply of ore used in armaments. The German withdrawal was far from orderly. The 20th Mountain Army attempted to conduct a phased retreat, but Soviet pressure and constant aerial bombardment made this increasingly difficult. Rearguard actions were organized along ridgelines and river crossings, where small groups of mountain infantry fought delaying battles. However, Soviet artillery superiority, combined with naval gunfire from the Northern Fleet, overwhelmed many positions. The Luftwaffe, limited to a handful of fighters and reconnaissance aircraft, could not contest Soviet control of the skies. The 7th Air Army flew hundreds of sorties daily, targeting columns of retreating German troops and convoys moving toward the Norwegian frontier. Civilian suffering escalated as the German forces implemented a scorched earth policy across the withdrawal zone. Villages were systematically burned, bridges destroyed, and livestock slaughtered or driven westward. Sami families and Finnish settlers were displaced in large numbers. In some cases, civilians were forcibly evacuated by the Germans to prevent them from aiding the Soviets, while others fled eastward to escape bombardments. The destruction of local infrastructure created a humanitarian crisis, as the advancing Soviets found entire communities in ruins with limited shelter or food supplies for the coming winter. Soviet progress, though rapid in territorial terms, was not without cost. Harsh weather, with snowfalls beginning in mid-October, combined with rough terrain and destroyed infrastructure, slowed advances. Supply lines had to be constantly repaired, with engineers building temporary bridges and corduroy roads to move artillery and fuel across marshy ground. Tank units often became bogged down, reducing their effectiveness, and infantry carried the burden of sustained assaults. The logistical challenge required continuous support from the Northern Fleet, which landed supplies in captured ports and used small craft to deliver reinforcements along the coast. The escalation of fighting also involved an increase in casualties. Soviet losses mounted as infantry advanced against fortified positions and minefields, often in exposed terrain with little natural cover. German reports claimed thousands of Soviet casualties during rearguard engagements, though these figures were likely exaggerated. Soviet records indicate heavy losses, but the weight of manpower and firepower ensured that momentum was maintained. German casualties likewise rose sharply, with hundreds killed or captured during each day of retreat. By mid-October, estimates suggest the Germans had lost more than 10,000 men in killed, wounded, or missing, while Soviet losses were higher but sustainable within the framework of the offensive. Politically, the escalation of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive had immediate significance. The Soviet Union presented the capture of Petsamo as a symbolic victory, the liberation of the last occupied Soviet territory. This message was broadcast widely to boost morale at home and to demonstrate to the Allies that Soviet forces were advancing on all fronts. In Berlin, the loss of Petsamo was recognized as a serious economic and strategic blow, further reducing the Reich's ability to sustain long-term war production. Propaganda emphasized the orderly retreat of the 20th Mountain Army, but the reality was one of relentless Soviet pressure and widespread destruction. Internationally, the offensive influenced Allied strategy. The Western Allies, already advancing into France and the Low Countries, viewed the Soviet success as further evidence of Germany's shrinking capacity to defend its occupied territories. Norwegian resistance movements also followed the campaign closely, as the Soviet advance into Finnmark would mark the first liberation of Norwegian soil by Allied forces. This development boosted morale among Norwegian partisans and linked the local struggle to the broader Allied effort. By 15th of October, Soviet spearheads had advanced beyond Petsamo toward the Litsa and Titovka rivers, while German forces retreated in the direction of Kirkenes. The offensive had escalated from a battle for a single town into a wide-ranging pursuit across hundreds of kilometers of Arctic terrain. For the Germans, the crisis was acute. Their rearguards were overstretched, their supply lines disrupted, and their defensive plans undermined by the speed of the Soviet advance. For the Soviets, the challenge was now to maintain momentum through worsening weather and logistical strain, in order to prevent the 20th Mountain Army from establishing strong defensive lines in Norway. The stage was set for the next, most intense phase of the campaign. Between 16 and 22 October 1944, the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive reached its peak. The Soviet 14th Army, supported by the 7th Air Army and the Northern Fleet, launched its largest and most sustained operations of the campaign, pressing into Norwegian Finnmark and attempting to cut off German rearguards before they could establish stable lines. For both sides, this was the most demanding stage of the battle, marked by intense fighting, severe weather, and immense logistical strain. The Soviet High Command committed its full weight to the pursuit. By mid-October, Merezkov's Karelian front had advanced over 50 kilometers from the initial lines, forcing the German 19th Mountain Corps into successive retreats. The 99th Rifle Corps spearheaded the central drive, advancing along the main road toward Kirkenes. On the southern flank, the 131st Rifle Division moved to outflank German positions by pushing through swampy tundra, while on the coastal axis, naval infantry landed behind enemy lines to disrupt communications. Naval gunfire from the Northern Fleet's destroyers and cruisers pounded German coastal batteries, softening resistance ahead of ground assaults. The heaviest fighting centered on river crossings, particularly the Titovka and Litsa rivers. German engineers had blown bridges and laid dense minefields, transforming natural barriers into formidable defensive lines. Soviet sappers worked under constant artillery and small arms fire to erect pontoons and repair crossing points. Infantry units waded through icy water in sub-zero temperatures, while artillery barrages attempted to suppress German strongpoints. Losses were heavy on both sides, but Soviet numerical superiority and firepower gradually overcame the obstacles. By 20th October, Soviet troops had forced multiple crossings, driving the Germans into a fighting retreat toward Kirkenes. Air operations reached their highest intensity in these days. The 7th Air Army flew more than 1,500 sorties during the peak of the campaign, striking retreating German columns, ferry terminals, and rear depots. IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft proved especially effective against convoys moving along the narrow Arctic roads where traffic jams made vehicles easy targets. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest control, but had only a handful of fighters left in the theater, often flying from distant bases in northern Norway. Soviet pilots dominated the skies, reporting dozens of successful strikes each day. For the Germans, the peak of the campaign meant a desperate attempt to execute Operation Nordlicht, the planned evacuation into Norway, while preventing the 20th Mountain Army from being destroyed. Rendulic's troops fought tenacious rearguard actions, often holding ridges and villages until nightfall before withdrawing further west. Units of the 2nd and 6th Mountain Divisions absorbed much of the Soviet pressure, suffering heavy casualties, but buying time for columns of vehicles and troops to retreat. German records from this period acknowledge the destruction or abandonment of large quantities of equipment, including artillery, vehicles, and supplies that could not be moved in the face of constant Soviet attacks. The civilian impact intensified during this stage. As German troops retreated into Finnmark, they carried out extensive scorched earth measures, destroying settlements, burning houses, and forcibly evacuating populations. In Kirkenes and surrounding villages, Norwegian civilians were displaced en masse, with many sent westward under German orders. Soviet troops advancing into Finnmark encountered widespread devastation, with few intact buildings and little infrastructure. Refugees often hid in forests and caves, enduring the onset of winter with minimal resources. The humanitarian toll was compounded by the destruction of reindeer herds and fishing stocks, essential to local survival. By 22nd October, Soviet units reached the outskirts of Kirkenes, the largest town in the region, and a vital German logistical hub. Heavy fighting erupted around defensive positions on the approaches, where German artillery and machine gun fire inflicted losses on advancing rifle divisions. Naval infantry supported the assault from the coast, while artillery fire from the Northern Fleet struck German fortifications. After 2 days of combat, Soviet troops entered Kirkenes on 25 October, capturing the town amid widespread destruction from both German demolitions and Soviet bombardments. The capture of Kirkenes represented the high point of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive. German forces were now fully in retreat, abandoning positions in eastern Finnmark and falling back toward. Soviet forces had advanced nearly 100 kilometers in less than 3 weeks, expelled the Germans from Soviet territory, and established a foothold in northern Norway. Yet the peak of the campaign also revealed its limitations. The Red Army had inflicted heavy casualties and captured significant ground, but the bulk of the German 20th Mountain Army remained intact, withdrawing westward in good order despite losses. The intensity of this stage underscored the character of Arctic warfare. Harsh terrain, extreme weather, and logistical challenges shaped the conduct of operations as much as combat itself. The Soviet capacity to coordinate artillery, air, and naval forces gave them the edge, while German discipline and scorched earth tactics ensured that their retreat remained costly for both their pursuers and the local population. The offensive had reached its climax, but its consequences would reverberate well beyond the battlefield. After the capture of Petsamo and Kirkenes, the campaign entered a phase defined by resistance and adaptation. Between late October and early November 1944, German forces sought to stabilize their retreat westward, while the Red Army adapted to new operational challenges in northern Norway. Although the Soviets had achieved their main objectives, expelling the Wehrmacht from Soviet soil and seizing the Petsamo nickel region, the continuation of fighting into Finnmark highlighted how both sides adjusted their strategies under the constraints of Arctic warfare. German resistance centered on disciplined rearguard actions. General Lothar Rendulic, commanding the 20th Mountain Army, recognized that the terrain of northern Norway offered favorable opportunities for delaying operations. Mountain passes, fjords, and rivers created natural choke points. Units of the 2nd and 6th Mountain Divisions, supported by engineers, mined roads, blew bridges, and constructed temporary strongpoints. These rearguards engaged Soviet advance units with machine guns and mortars before withdrawing under cover of darkness. Though losses mounted, this method allowed the bulk of German formations to retreat westward intact. The discipline of these actions was notable. Despite pressure from Soviet artillery and airstrikes, German columns maintained cohesion and avoided encirclement. At the same time, German adaptation involved scorched earth tactics on a massive scale. Villages and towns throughout Finnmark were systematically destroyed to deny shelter to Soviet troops and to civilians who might assist them. In Kirkenes, 2,000 of the town's 3,000 houses were burned before Soviet entry, and this pattern was repeated across the region. Civilians were forcibly evacuated westward, with more than 40,000 Norwegians displaced by German orders. Infrastructure, ports, bridges, power stations was demolished. This policy inflicted a severe humanitarian crisis on the Norwegian population, which endured the onset of Arctic winter with minimal shelter. The Soviets, having advanced swiftly, now faced the challenge of operating in devastated territory. Supply difficulties intensified as roads were destroyed and settlements rendered uninhabitable. To maintain momentum, Soviet engineers rapidly constructed makeshift bridges and corduroy roads. Reindeer teams and sleds supplemented motor transport, while naval supply convoys along the coast attempted to deliver fuel, ammunition, and rations. The Red Army also deployed ski battalions and mountain troops accustomed to Arctic conditions. This adaptation was crucial, as heavy tanks proved almost useless in the broken terrain and early snowfalls further restricted mobility. The psychological toll of the campaign was evident on both sides. German soldiers, though conducting orderly retreats, faced exhaustion after weeks of marching through harsh terrain under constant air attack. Soviet troops, victorious but undersupplied, struggled with cold, hunger, and fatigue. Letters and reports indicate that morale among Soviet units was mixed. Pride in expelling the Germans from Soviet territory was tempered by the hardships of pursuing them into barren Norwegian landscapes. Partisan activity and local resistance in Norway also adapted to the shifting front. Norwegian fighters, previously limited in scope, intensified operations once the Soviets advanced into Finnmark. Partisan groups provided intelligence to the Red Army, guided units through difficult terrain, and helped civilians survive the scorched earth devastation. German countermeasures against partisans remained brutal, with reprisals carried out against suspected sympathizers, further compounding civilian. Politically, adaptation was visible in the coordination between the Soviet Union and Norway's government in exile. The Soviets emphasized that their presence in Finnmark was temporary and designed to expel German occupiers seeking to reassure Allied partners. Norwegian leaders welcomed the liberation of their soil, but were mindful of the geopolitical implications of Soviet troops operating in their territory. The Red Army, for its part, limited its advance to eastern Finnmark after late October, halting near the Tana River rather than pushing deeper into Norway. By early November, resistance and adaptation had defined the campaign's final phase. German forces, though retreating, remained intact and capable of further delaying actions. Soviet troops, though victorious, had reached the limits of their supply capacity in devastated terrain. Civilians, caught between both armies, bore the brunt of scorched earth destruction and mass displacement. The Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive thus entered its concluding stages, marked not by large-scale battles, but by the endurance of armies and populations forced to adapt to the harshest conditions of the European war. The turning point of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive came in the final week of October 1944, when the Soviet drive westward into Finnmark began to lose momentum, and the Germans succeeded in transforming their retreat into an orderly withdrawal rather than a rout. The Soviet capture of Petsamo on 12th October and Kirkenes on 25th October had fulfilled the principal goals of the campaign, but beyond these successes, the offensive reached its natural limits. What emerged in this stage was not a sudden battlefield reversal. The decisive point was reached when the Red Army, despite its superior numbers and firepower, could no longer sustain rapid advances across devastated terrain, while the Germans, through disciplined rearguard actions and scorched earth tactics, avoided encirclement and preserved the core of the 20th Mountain Army. The German withdrawal plan, Operation Nordlicht, had been conceived as a series of staged retreats into northern Norway. By late October, Rendulic's forces had successfully executed 2 such phases, falling back from Petsamo to Kirkenes and then beyond the Tana River. Although losses were heavy, tens of thousands of men killed, wounded, or captured, along with large amounts of equipment, the German command managed to preserve its divisions as organized formations. The destruction of roads, bridges, and settlements slowed Soviet pursuit to the point that large-scale encirclements became impossible. In this sense, the turning point of the campaign was not a dramatic German counterattack, but the successful transition from defense to mobile withdrawal under overwhelming pressure. For the Soviets, the limitations became increasingly apparent after the fall of Kirkenes. The 14th Army had advanced nearly 100 kilometers in less than 3 weeks, expelling the Germans from Soviet soil and liberating eastern Finnmark. Yet the same speed that produced success also created logistical overstretch. Supplies had to be hauled across tundra and marshes on improvised roads, while harsh Arctic weather, with snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures, further slowed the movement of fuel and ammunition. Tanks and heavy artillery were often left behind or became immobilized, forcing the offensive to rely primarily on infantry supported by lighter weapons. Engineers worked constantly to repair demolished infrastructure, but the rate of the Luftwaffe's weakness had been a constant throughout the campaign, but German adaptation in the air war was reflected in more effective use of anti-aircraft defenses and dispersal of columns. While Soviet aviation continued to dominate, the density of targets diminished as the Germans retreated into Norway, limiting the effectiveness of air power and preventing withdrawal. Similarly, the Northern Fleet, which had provided bombardments and amphibious support in earlier stages, found its role reduced as the front moved inland, away from coastal areas where naval gunfire could be decisive. For the German troops, the turning point meant a transition from desperate resistance to the grim relief of successful retreat. Soldiers of the 2nd and 6th Mountain Divisions, though depleted, managed to escape encirclement and maintain cohesion. Discipline and training in mountain warfare proved essential in navigating the harsh terrain and maintaining order under pressure. Reports from the German side emphasize exhaustion, but also pride in having denied the Soviets a complete destruction of their army. For Soviet soldiers, the turning point was experienced as a mix of achievement and frustration. They had cleared the Germans from Soviet soil and inflicted severe damage, but the opportunity to annihilate the 20th Mountain Army slipped away. The civilian dimension underscored the broader consequences of this shift. As German troops retreated, they expanded their scorched earth policy across Finnmark, destroying virtually every settlement in their path. More than 40,000 Norwegians were forcibly evacuated, with thousands transported westward or left in improvised camps. Those who avoided evacuation often hid in caves, forests, or mountains, enduring the harsh Arctic winter without shelter. The devastation of Finnmark became one of the defining legacies of the campaign, and it was during this turning point that the full scope of destruction became irreversible. The Soviet advance liberated communities, but the inhabitants often returned to ruins, highlighting the humanitarian toll of the German retreat strategy. Strategically, the turning point of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive reflected the balance between Soviet success and German survival. The Red Army achieved all its immediate objectives. The nickel mines of Petsamo were lost to Germany, Murmansk and its vital supply line were secured, and the Soviets had entered Norway, liberating part of Finnmark. Yet the German 20th Mountain Army remained a fighting force, retreating deeper into Norway where it would continue to resist until the final months of the war. From Moscow's perspective, the offensive was a victory, but not an annihilation. From Berlin's perspective, it was a defeat tempered by the preservation of manpower and the orderly conduct of withdrawal. In the broader context of the war, this turning point was significant because it demonstrated the limits of Soviet offensive capability in extreme environments. Even with overwhelming numerical superiority, more than 100,000 Soviet troops against fewer than 50,000 Germans in the immediate Petsamo sector, the Red Army could not completely destroy its opponent. Instead, the campaign underscored how geography, weather, and scorched earth tactics could offset even large disparities in strength. The Germans, while losing territory and resources, succeeded in carrying out one of their most extensive and destructive retreats of the war. Thus, by the end of October 1944, the Petsamo Kirkenes, the Soviets had won strategically and territorially, but operationally, the Germans had achieved their aim of avoiding encirclement and maintaining an organized retreat. The turning point lay in this balance: a Soviet victory that secured critical objectives, and a German withdrawal that preserved their northern army, setting the stage for continued fighting in Norway and leaving behind a landscape of devastation that shaped the post-war memory of the campaign. By the beginning of November 1944, the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive had passed into its aftermath. The main combat operations ceased as the German 20th Mountain Army completed its withdrawal into central and western Finnmark, while the Red Army halted further pursuit beyond the Tana River. For the Soviets, the offensive ended in a clear territorial victory, but its final stage highlighted the limitations of continuing the campaign deeper into Norway. For the Germans, the aftermath was characterized by destruction and retreat, leaving a scorched landscape that would have lasting consequences for the civilian population. The end of fighting around Kirkenes and the Tana River saw the Soviet 14th Army consolidate its gains. Units were tasked with securing liberated areas, rebuilding infrastructure, and organizing supply depots in ruined settlements. Naval forces of the Northern Fleet continued patrols along the coast, preventing any German attempts at counterlandings. Air operations decreased as the front stabilized, though reconnaissance flights monitored German movements farther west. Soviet commanders judged that extending the offensive would overstretch their already fragile logistics. Harsh weather conditions, destroyed transport networks, and the onset of Arctic winter made continued large-scale operations impractical. German forces, though battered, had successfully executed their retreat according to the Nordlicht Plan. Roughly 45,000 troops of the 19th Mountain Corps and supporting units withdrew into Norway, maintaining their cohesion. They abandoned heavy weapons, destroyed depots, and demolished bridges, but they preserved the fighting core of the 20th Mountain Army. The retreat, however, left behind a devastated landscape. Finnmark's towns and villages were reduced to ashes. In Kirkenes, only a fraction of buildings survived. In Vadsø, Hammerfest, and smaller communities, the pattern was repeated. Scorched earth tactics left the region almost uninhabitable during the winter of 1944-45. For civilians, the immediate consequences were catastrophic. More than 40,000 Norwegians were forcibly evacuated, often marched westward under German control or transported on ships. Others fled into forests, mountains, and caves, surviving in improvised shelters. The destruction of food stocks and livestock created the Soviet advance brought liberation, but also exposed civilians to the harsh realities of life in devastated settlements with little infrastructure. Humanitarian crises were compounded by reprisals. German forces targeted suspected partisans and collaborators, executing individuals and burning entire communities in reprisal actions. Soviet reports documented the scale of devastation, while Norwegian survivors later recalled the winter of 1944-45 as one of the hardest periods of occupation and displacement. The Soviet military, though primarily focused on operations, also distributed rations and assisted in limited reconstruction to stabilize the liberated areas. Politically, the aftermath of the operation was significant. Moscow presented the victory as proof of the Red Army's ability to fight and win in the most extreme environments, showcasing the liberation of Soviet and Norwegian territory as evidence of its role as a liberator. In Norway, the arrival of Soviet troops in Finnmark was welcomed as a turning point in the occupation, though it also raised questions about post-war influence. To reassure its allies, the Soviet Union limited its advance, halting operations before moving deeper into Norway. This restraint was carefully noted in London and Washington, which saw it as a gesture of Allied cooperation. Thus, the immediate consequences of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive were twofold: the military expulsion of the Wehrmacht from the eastern Arctic and the humanitarian disaster left behind by scorched earth retreat. The Germans preserved their forces, but at the cost of devastation that scarred northern Norway for years. The Soviets secured their strategic objectives, but stopped short of further advances. In the devastated towns and empty villages of Finnmark, the civilian population bore the heaviest burden of the campaign's aftermath. The legacy of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive extended far beyond the Arctic battlefields of October 1944. Though overshadowed by the massive Soviet operations in Belarus, the Baltic states, and later in Poland, this campaign demonstrated how even in the most remote theaters, the war was fought with intensity and strategic calculation. Its consequences were felt in military planning, economic resources, political relations, and historical memory across multiple nations. Militarily, the operation was one of the most successful Red Army offensives of 1944 in terms of achieving clearly defined objectives within a short time. In less than 3 weeks, German casualties amounted to approximately 30,000 killed, wounded, or captured, while the Soviets also incurred heavy losses, estimated at over 20,000 across the rifle divisions and support units committed. These figures reflect not only the intensity of fighting, but also the difficulty of operating in extreme Arctic conditions. Strategically, the offensive had profound implications. For Germany, the loss of Petsamo was a severe economic blow. The nickel mines had provided tens of thousands of tons of ore annually, essential for producing hardened steel for tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels. The sudden cutoff of this resource accelerated shortages already felt in the German war industry. The retreat into Norway also marked the end of German ambitions in the Arctic, reducing their ability to threaten the Murmansk front or to interfere with Allied Arctic convoys. For the Soviet Union, the operation secured its northern flank for the remainder of the war and allowed resources to be redirected southward toward the decisive campaigns in East Prussia, Poland, and Hungary. Politically, the offensive highlighted the shifting balance of power in Northern Europe. The Soviet Union's entry into Norwegian territory carried significant geopolitical weight. For the Norwegian population, the Red Army's arrival meant liberation after years of occupation and the beginning of rebuilding in Finnmark. For the Norwegian government in exile and its Western allies, it raised questions about Soviet intentions in Scandinavia. The Soviet decision to halt operations at the Tana River and not to advance further into central Norway was a calculated move, intended to reassure Britain and the United States. This restraint later allowed post-war relations between Norway and the Soviet Union to develop without the kind of territorial disputes that marked Soviet interactions with Eastern Europe. For civilians, the legacy was defined by destruction and recovery. The German scorched earth policy left Finnmark devastated. More than 11,000 houses were burned, infrastructure destroyed, and over 40,000 civilians displaced. Entire communities were forced to survive the winter of 1944-45 in caves, tents, or improvised shelters. The memory of this devastation became central to Norwegian wartime experience, symbolizing both suffering and resilience. Soviet assistance in providing food and medical support in the immediate aftermath was remembered with gratitude, though the destruction carried out by retreating German forces left scars that would take decades to heal. In Soviet historiography, the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive was portrayed as a demonstration of Red Army skill and determination in extreme conditions. Emphasis was placed on the coordination of land, naval, and air forces, showcasing the effectiveness of combined arms operations. The campaign became an example of how Soviet forces could adapt to any environment, from the deserts of Central Asia to the frozen tundra of the Arctic. In Norway, memory focused more on the destruction of Finnmark and the liberation of Kirkenes, with monuments erected to commemorate both civilian suffering and the arrival of Soviet forces. Historians continue to debate the broader significance of the offensive. Some argue that it was strategically limited, affecting only a peripheral front, while others stress its importance in securing Allied supply lines and eliminating Germany's economic resources in the north. The campaign also demonstrated the increasing ability of the Red Army to conduct well-planned operations far from its traditional theaters, reflecting a maturity of organization that contrasted sharply with its struggles in 1941. The long-term cultural and political legacy of the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive lies in its symbolic role. It was the only major Soviet operation that liberated territory belonging to a Western ally, not just Soviet soil. This gave the campaign a special place in Allied wartime cooperation. In post-war Norway, the liberation of Kirkenes remained a reminder of Soviet contributions, though the Cold War would later complicate the narrative. In Russia, the memory of the operation is preserved as one of the victories of 1944, marking the steady progress toward ultimate victory in Berlin. Thus, the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive occupies a unique place in the history of the Second World War. It was a campaign fought at the edge of Europe, in an unforgiving environment, yet its consequences rippled across the continent. Militarily, it secured the Arctic for the Allies. Economically, it deprived Germany of critical resources. Politically, it balanced liberation with restraint. And culturally, it left lasting memories of devastation and survival in Finnmark. In this way, the offensive stands as both a successful military operation and a defining moment in the wartime history of Northern Europe.